My name is Nora Callahan, and on the day my father's will was read, I found out I had inherited nothing. Not the house. Not the business. Not $1 of the $4 million he was worth on paper. Everything, every last cent, went to my brother. That was the plan my parents thought they had made. It was not the plan they actually signed. I did not know that yet. Nobody in that room did, except one man in a gray suit holding a sealed envelope he had been waiting 11 months to open. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope, you need to understand the 31 years that led us to that office, because none of this makes sense without them. If you're new here, welcome. Stay until the end, because this story does not go where you think it goes. And if stories like this hit close to home, hit subscribe before we start, because I post one of these every week. I grew up in Ashland, a small lake town in northern Wisconsin, in a house my grandfather built with lumber from his own hardware store. Callahan and Sons Hardware had been open on Main Street since 1962. My father, Frank Callahan, inherited it from his father, and everyone in town assumed my older brother, Derek, would inherit it from him. Derek was born for that store the way some kids are born for baseball. He had our father's laugh, our father's handshake, our father's way of standing behind a counter like he owned the whole street, which, eventually, he did. I was born 2 years after Derek, and I was born, as my mother liked to say at dinner parties, with my nose in a book instead of a nail gun in my hand. It was said fondly, always with a small laugh. It was said often, and every time, I understood a little more clearly where I stood. My parents were not cruel people. I want to be fair about that, because this is not a story about monsters. They loved Derek loudly. They loved me quietly, in the spaces between the loud parts, and when you are a child, quiet love feels a lot like no love at all. Derek got a truck for his 16th birthday, paid for with store money, because he was going to need it for delivery someday. I got a card with $40 in it and a note that said, "Use this for something practical." Derek got pulled out of school 2 afternoons a week starting in 9th grade to learn inventory and bookkeeping. I got told, when I asked to learn too, that the store was Derek's future and I should focus on my grades since I was, apparently, the smart one. It was not until I was 34 years old, sitting in a lawyer's office, that I understood being the smart one was never a compliment in that family. It was a consolation prize. I left Ashland at 18 and did not look back for a long time. I went to nursing school 2 hours south in Eau Claire, worked nights in the emergency room to pay for it, and built a life that had nothing to do with hammers or hinges or a store with our last name painted across the front window. I married a good, unremarkable man named Tom who fixed small engines for a living and never once made me feel like I needed to apologize for choosing Scrubs over a stockroom. We had 2 kids, a mortgage, a used minivan with 200,000 miles on it, and a life that nobody in my family ever asked me a single question about. Derek, meanwhile, stayed in Ashland, took over daily operations of the store the summer he turned 25, and became exactly what everyone always expected him to become. The golden son, finally holding the thing he was raised to hold. Here is the part that matters, the part you need to remember for later. My father was proud of Derek in public. He talked about him at the diner, at church, at the Rotary Club breakfast every second Tuesday of the month. But in private, in the kitchen, late at night, my mother sometimes called me and said things she never said to anyone else. Small things. Worried things. Your brother is spending more than the store is bringing in, Nora. I do not understand where the money goes. She said it the first time when I was 29. I told her it was probably nothing, a slow season, inventory costs, the kind of thing every small business goes through. I did not think much of it then. I had my own life, my own babies, my own 12-hour shifts. I did not know that sentence was the first thread of something that would take 9 more years to fully unravel, and that when it finally did unravel, it would happen in front of half the town, in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and old paper, with my brother's face going the color of drywall while a lawyer read 4 sentences that changed everything. My father had his first stroke when I was 31. It was mild, the doctor said. A warning shot. He recovered most of his speech within 6 weeks and nearly all of his mobility within 4 months, but something else did not fully recover, something quieter, something that would not show up on a scan for another 3 years. That stroke was turning point number 1, though none of us knew it yet. It was the moment my father's judgment started to erode by degrees so small that nobody noticed the slope until we were already at the bottom of it. And it was the moment my brother, whether he understood what he was doing or not, began positioning himself to become the only person left standing when the ground finally gave way. Turning point number 2 came 8 months after the stroke. On a Sunday afternoon I only heard about secondhand. Derek drove our father to a law office in Superior, 40 minutes outside of Ashland, a firm my parents had never used before. He told our mother it was routine, just updating some paperwork now that Dad's health was a concern. What he did not mention was that the document he had drafted named himself as sole power of attorney over both our father's medical decisions and every financial account tied to Callahan and Sons Hardware. Our father signed it in a fog that Derek later described, to anyone who asked, as him having a good day. My mother found out 3 weeks later when she tried to move money between accounts to pay a roofer and discovered she needed Derek's signature to do it. That was turning point number 3. She called me that night, and for the first time in my adult life, she cried on the phone. I want to pause here and be honest with you about something, because I think it matters. I did not swoop in. I did not drive to Ashland and demand answers. I had a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old, a husband working overtime, and a job where people's hearts stopped in front of me. I told my mother to talk to Derek, to ask questions, to request a copy of the document. I believed, the way you believe things you have never had reason to doubt, that my brother was careless, not calculating, because that was easier than the alternative, and because for 31 years, nobody in that family had asked me to believe anything harder. That was my mistake, and I have made peace with it, but I will not pretend otherwise. Turning point number 4 was my own silence, and it lasted almost 2 full years. During those 2 years, the store began to change in ways that only showed up if you knew where to look. My mother mentioned, almost in passing, that Derek had put in a new truck fleet, 3 vehicles, all financed. She mentioned a boat he bought that spring, docked at the marina, something he said was for client relationships, whatever that meant for a hardware store. She mentioned a trip to Cancun he took with his girlfriend at the time, and how proud he seemed showing photos at Sunday dinner, and how our father beamed at every picture like Derek had just closed the biggest deal of his career instead of spending money nobody had confirmed the store was actually making. Turning points 5, 6, and 7, stacked on top of each other, each small enough to explain away, each a thread pulling tighter around a truth none of us wanted to face. Then came the diagnosis. My mother found a lump during a routine exam in October, the same October my youngest started kindergarten. Stage 2, the doctor said, treatable, aggressive but treatable, and I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear thinking, this is the moment everyone finally sees clearly. This is the moment Derek steps up the way I have stepped up my whole life, without anyone noticing. I was wrong. Derek visited twice during her first round of chemotherapy. I drove 3 hours each way, 6 hours round trip, every Thursday for 4 months, because Thursdays were my day off, and because somebody needed to sit with her during the infusions and hold the little pink basin when the nausea hit. I never posted about it and rarely mentioned it, mostly because I was no longer invited to Sunday dinner. Derek had started hosting them at his place, and somewhere along the way, my name had quietly fallen off the guest list. Turning point 8. My father's dementia became undeniable the same winter my mother finished chemo. He forgot the code to the store's back door, the one he had used for 4 decades. He called me Sandra once, my mother's name, and looked confused when I corrected him. He wandered out of the house at 2 in the morning in January and was found by a neighbor sitting on the curb in his slippers, waiting, he told them, for the delivery truck. That was turning point 9, and it finally brought me back to Ashland, at least for a while. I took a leave of absence from the hospital. Tom kept the kids fed and in school 2 hours south while I drove up every Monday and stayed until Friday, sleeping in my childhood bedroom, which Derek, I noticed, had converted into a storage room for boxes of receipts he said were for the store's records. I want to tell you what I found in those boxes, because it matters later, but at the time I did not understand what I was looking at. Invoices for equipment I never saw on the sales floor. Payments to a supplier in Minneapolis that did not match anything in the store's public inventory. A line of credit, opened 2 years earlier, for an amount that made my stomach drop when I did the math on a napkin at 2 in the morning. I did not say anything to Derek. I did not say anything to my parents, because my father could no longer follow a conversation that had more than 2 steps in it, and my mother was exhausted in a way that went past her body and settled somewhere in her eyes. But I photographed every page. Every single one, with my phone, in the dark, sitting on the floor of my old bedroom surrounded by boxes that were never supposed to be found by anyone who could read a balance sheet. Turning point 10. I did not know yet what I would do with those photographs. I only knew, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes color, that someday I would need them. Turning point 11 happened on a Tuesday in March, and I only learned the details months later, from my mother, in a hospital bed, in a voice gone thin as paper. She had asked Derek to drive her to a hair appointment, and on the way, asked him to stop at the pharmacy first. While he waited in the truck, she walked 2 doors down instead, into the office of Arthur Beck, the attorney who had handled Callahan family business since before I was born, the same man who had drawn up my grandfather's original will in 1962. She was inside 11 minutes and told Arthur 3 things that day, things she made him swear to keep confidential until the time was right. I would not learn what those 3 things were until everything came apart in his conference room, but hold on to this moment. It is the hinge this whole story swings on. 2 weeks after that hair appointment, Derek called a family meeting, the first one he had organized in years. He sat our parents down at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once received a card with $40 in it, and told them it was time to simplify things. Dad's health was declining. Mom was still recovering her strength. The store needed one clear decision maker so there would be no confusion if something happened suddenly. He had already drafted the paperwork. All they needed to do was sign. Turning point 12. My father signed without reading past the first page, because by then he could not hold a full page of legal language in his head long enough to finish it. My mother signed too, though she told me later she signed only because Derek stood behind her chair while she read it, and because Arthur Beck had told her, quietly, weeks earlier, not to fight him on it yet. I did not know any of this was happening. I was 2 hours south, working double shifts after Tom's hours got cut, and the calls from home had slowed to once a week, brief and careful. When my mother did call, she sounded lighter, in a way that confused me. I thought it was relief, maybe some peace she and Derek had found. I did not understand that her lightness was not relief. It was the calm of a woman who had already made her decision, and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. Turning point 13 was my own misreading of that call. My father died in April, 11 months before I sat in Arthur Beck's office and learned what my mother had actually done. It was his heart, quietly giving out in his sleep on a Sunday morning while my mother made coffee downstairs. Derek called at 6:40. His voice was steady, almost businesslike, and the first thing he told me, after our father was gone, was that he had already called the funeral home and the paper. I stood in my kitchen in my scrubs, ready for a shift I would end up calling out of, thinking grief looks different on everyone, and maybe this was just how Derek grieved, by managing. I gave him the benefit of the doubt one more time. It was the last time. Turning point 14. The funeral was large. Ashland is a small town, and Frank Callahan had run the store on Main Street for 40 years, so half the county showed up. Derek gave the eulogy. He talked about our father teaching him the table saw at 9, about summer stocking shelves together, about the store as a kind of church. He did not mention me once, in a eulogy that ran nearly 12 minutes. I sat with my children on either side of me and my mother's hand cold in mine, and I understood, watching him speak, that he was not just burying our father. He was finishing the story he had been writing about our family since he was old enough to hold a hammer. Turning point 15. I did not correct him. I let him have his 12 minutes, because some fights are not worth winning in front of a casket. What none of us knew, sitting in those pews, was that the funeral had been paid for almost entirely out of the store's operating account, an account nearly $200,000 in debt from a line of credit Derek had quietly expanded 3 times in 4 years. I would not learn the real number until later, but sit with it now, because it changes what you think you know about what my brother stood to inherit. He was not just inheriting a business. He was inheriting a hole, and he was the only one who knew how deep it went. My mother declined fast after that, faster than the doctors expected, the way people do when the person they built their life around is suddenly gone. I moved back for what became her final 10 weeks, sleeping on a cot beside her bed, and in the middle of the night she said things I did not fully understand until it was almost too late. "Talk to Arthur," she said once, gripping my hand hard enough to leave marks. "He knows what I really wanted." Turning point 16. I thought it was the medication talking. I was wrong about that too. She held on for 6 more weeks. In the last of them, she stopped asking about the store, stopped asking about Derek, and started asking, every day, to see photographs of my kids on my phone, scrolling with one finger, lingering on their faces like she was memorizing something she was running out of time to memorize. I did not understand yet what she was really doing during those long, quiet afternoons. I only understood that some decision had been made and settled, and that whatever it was, she carried it alone, the way she had carried most things in that house for 40 years. Turning point 17. She died on a Thursday morning in early March, with my hand in hers, almost exactly a year after that first quiet visit to Arthur Beck's office, and I did not yet know the waiting was almost over. The second funeral came 11 days later, smaller and quieter than the first, the kind of gathering where people run out of things to say by the third handshake. Derek stood at the front again. He did not ask me to speak, and by then I had stopped expecting him to. What surprised me was how calm I felt, a stillness I did not fully understand yet. Turning point 18. Derek arrived at the reception already talking about next steps, using words like transition and continuity, the same words he had used in every store meeting for a decade. He hugged people. He accepted condolences with the practiced grace of a man who had been rehearsing this exact moment longer than any of us wanted to admit. Arthur Beck approached me at the reception, in the church basement, over a folding table of casseroles nobody was eating. He was older than I remembered, silver-haired now, but his eyes were sharp when they found mine across the room. He did not say much. He touched my arm, told me he was sorry for my loss, and then, quietly, in a voice pitched for only me to hear, said, "Come see me Thursday. Alone if you can manage it. Not with Derek." I did not ask why. Something in the way he said it told me not to ask, not there, not with half the county still filing past the casket photos near the door. Turning point 19. I nodded, and he moved on to shake Derek's hand, smiling the same practiced smile he had probably given grieving families in Ashland for 40 years. I did not go to that meeting alone. I called Tom that night and told him I needed him there, not because I thought I would need support exactly, but because some part of me, the part that had spent 9 years photographing invoices in the dark, already suspected that whatever Arthur Beck had to say was not going to be simple. Tom drove up Wednesday night. We sat at my mother's kitchen table, the same one where I had received a $40 birthday card 20 years earlier, and I told him everything. The boxes. The line of credit. The way my mother's voice had sounded lighter after that hair appointment I did not understand until months later. Tom listened the way he always listens, without interrupting, and when I finished, he said one thing. "Whatever it is, we will handle it together." Turning point 20. The official reading was scheduled for the following Monday, 10 days after the funeral, in Arthur Beck's conference room above the old bank building on 3rd Street. Derek requested it be formal, everyone present at once, rather than the quieter one-on-one conversations some families prefer. I understood why later. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the town to know exactly what he had inherited and exactly how much bigger his life was about to become. He arrived 12 minutes early in a suit I had never seen him wear, dark navy, tailored, the kind of suit a man buys when he already knows he is about to become the most important person in a room. Turning point 21. He shook Arthur's hand like he was closing a deal. He barely looked at me. The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and old paper, exactly the way conference rooms in small towns always smell, and Arthur sat at the head of a long oak table with a manila folder in front of him and a sealed envelope beside it, off to the side. The kind of envelope that made my stomach tighten the moment I saw it, though I could not have told you why. Derek sat across from me. He crossed his legs, checked his watch once, and gave me a look I recognized from childhood, the look of someone who already knows how the story ends and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Turning point 22. Arthur cleared his throat, opened the manila folder, and began to read in the flat, careful voice of a man who has done this 1,000 times before and has learned, over 4 decades, not to let his face show what he already knows is coming. The language was formal, full of their force and whereas clauses, but the substance of it landed like individual stones. The house on Birch Street to my son, Derek Frank Callahan. The business known as Callahan and Sons Hardware, including all assets, inventory, and accounts, to my son, Derek Frank Callahan. All remaining liquid assets, savings, and investment accounts, to my son, Derek Frank Callahan. I sat very still. I did not look at Derek. I did not need to see his face to know exactly what expression it was wearing. I had spent my whole life watching that face light up every time our parents said his name and mine went unspoken. Turning point 23. Arthur's voice continued, steady, unhurried, reading toward the final line of the document, the one that would confirm what everyone in that room, including me, already believed was the entire story. To my daughter, Nora Elizabeth Callahan, I leave nothing, as she has chosen a path outside this family's legacy. The words landed exactly as intended. I felt Tom's hand find mine under the table, gripping hard. I did not cry. I want you to understand that, because I think it matters, because I think there is a version of this story where I fall apart in that chair and Derek gets to watch it happen, and that is not what happened. I sat with my spine straight and my hands folded and I waited, the way I had learned to wait my entire life, for whatever came next. What came next was Arthur Beck setting down the manila folder, picking up the sealed envelope beside it, and saying 4 words that made my brother's confident smile falter for the very first time that day. There is one more document. Arthur broke the seal slowly, the way a man handles something he has guarded a long time. Inside was a single document, 4 pages, dated the same March morning my mother had asked Derek to wait in the truck outside the pharmacy. An irrevocable family trust, established that day, witnessed by Arthur's paralegal and a bank notary, naming my 2 children as beneficiaries and me as sole trustee. Turning point 24. Into that trust, my mother had placed something none of us ever thought to separate from the store. The half-acre of land beneath Callahan and Sons Hardware, land my grandfather had bought outright in 1958, for years before he built on it. Land that never actually belonged to the business, only to whoever held the deed to the ground it stood on. Arthur explained it the way he must have explained it to my mother, patiently, in plain language. The will Derek inherited gave him the business, the inventory, the accounts, the building. But the land underneath, the single most valuable asset in the estate, had been legally separated from all of it 11 months before my father signed his final will. My mother had done this alone, without telling my father or Derek, using a small inheritance of her own. Nobody in our family knew she still had. Turning point 25. She had not touched the store, or Derek's inheritance directly. She had simply reached underneath it and pulled out the one thing that made it worth anything at all. Derek's face changed slowly, the way weather changes over a lake, no single moment, just a steady darkening. That is not legal, he said. She would have needed Dad's signature too, community assets. Arthur slid a second document across the table without a word. The land had been titled in my mother's name alone since 1958, a detail nobody had looked at in 60 years because nobody had needed to. My grandfather had put it in her name as a wedding gift, an old-fashioned arrangement even then, and it had simply sat there, forgotten, technically hers alone the entire time. Turning point 26. She did not need my father's signature. She never had. What happened next in that room happened slowly, the way understanding has to travel through a person before it becomes real. Derek asked what it meant, practically, for the store, and Arthur told him plainly. He owned the building, the inventory, every account, including the line of credit that had ballooned to nearly $230,000. A debt I had photographed in the dark of my old bedroom years earlier and quietly given to Arthur once I understood those boxes were not just records. Turning point 27. But he did not own the ground the building stood on. Without that, the store could not legally operate past the end of a lease Arthur's office was already prepared to draft, one naming me, as trustee, landlord of the land beneath my brother's inheritance. Derek stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. He said several things I will not repeat here, about betrayal, about a will he called worthless, about calling his own lawyer before the end of the day. Arthur, calm the entire time, reminded him the estate document was airtight, executed by a woman with 2 independent medical evaluations confirming full cognitive competency, filed and notarized months before either of my parents' health declined. There would be no successful challenge, only a long, expensive legal process Derek, given the debt he already carried, could not afford to lose. Turning point 28. I watched my brother, for the first time in 34 years, run out of a plan. I did not gloat. I want you to know that, because it would have been easy to let 9 years of quiet accumulate into something loud. Instead, I said one thing to him before Tom, and I left that room. I am not taking the store from you, Derek. I never wanted the store. I am simply not going to let you pretend our mother did not know exactly what she was doing when she signed her name to something you never knew existed. Turning point 29. He did not answer. He walked out ahead of us, and I have not spoken to him since, though I hear, through the same small-town channels that once carried news of my wedding, that the store closed for good 11 months later, the debt finally too heavy for the ground beneath it to hold up alone. Here is what I know now that I did not know sitting in that conference room. My mother spent the last year of her life quietly undoing 30 years of a story she had helped write, one where I was the afterthought and Derek was the future. She did not do it with anger. She did it with paperwork, patiently, the same way I had learned, without ever being taught, to keep records of everything that mattered. Turning point 30. The trust protects my children's education, a modest but stable fund neither will ever have to build from nothing the way I did. It is not a fortune. It was never meant to be one. It was meant to say, in the only language my mother ever felt safe using, that she saw me, finally, even if it took her until the very end to say it out loud. If someone in your life is quietly keeping score of the wrong things, tell me in the comments. And if this reminded you that love sometimes hides in the paperwork, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.